2 miles down in the South Pacific, something sits in the darkness that represents one of the most heartbreaking losses in American military history. March 2018. Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel detected a shipwreck on the seafloor north of the Solomon Islands. When the ROV descended with cameras, what it found made naval historians immediately recognize the distinctive profile. The USS Juneau, the light cruiser that sank on November 13, 1942, taking 687 men with her. But the Juneau isn't famous just because of the death toll. She's famous because 5 brothers died aboard her. George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan had enlisted together in January 1942, right after Pearl Harbor. They'd made one demand of the Navy: they would only serve if they could serve together, on the same ship. The Navy had a policy against this. Brothers weren't supposed to serve on the same vessel, precisely to prevent situations where one family could lose multiple sons, but the Sullivans insisted, and somehow the Navy agreed. 10 months later, all 5 brothers were dead, killed when a Japanese submarine put a single torpedo into the Juneau during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The ship's magazine exploded. The cruiser broke in half and sank in 20 minutes. Of the 687 men aboard, only 10 survived. The Sullivan parents received 5 telegrams on the same day, each one informing them that another son was missing and presumed dead. The tragedy was so profound, so unprecedented, that it changed American military policy forever. Today, the sole survivor policy prevents siblings from serving in the same unit or on the same ship during wartime, and it exists because of what happened to the Juneau and the 5 Sullivan brothers on November 13, 1942. To understand why the Juneau's loss matters, you need to understand who the Sullivan brothers were and why they insisted on serving together. George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan grew up in Waterloo, Iowa, during the Great Depression. They were a close-knit family. The brothers worked together, spent their free time together, and looked out for each other. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, all 5 brothers immediately decided to enlist, but they had a condition. They would only join the Navy if they could serve on the same ship. The Navy recruiter in Waterloo tried to explain that this wasn't how things worked. Military policy, written after World War I, discouraged brothers from serving on the same vessel. The reasoning was simple: if a ship was sunk, a family shouldn't lose multiple sons at once. But the Sullivans were adamant: all 5 together, or none at all. The recruiter contacted his superiors. The request went up the chain of command, and somehow in January 1942, with the Navy desperate for recruits after Pearl Harbor, an exception was made. The 5 Sullivan brothers enlisted together, and were assigned to the USS Juneau, a new Atlanta-class light cruiser that had just been commissioned. The USS Juneau was 541 feet long, displacing 6,000 tons. She carried 16 5-inch guns in 8 twin mounts, making her one of the most heavily armed anti-aircraft cruisers in the fleet. Atlanta-class cruisers were designed specifically to protect aircraft carriers from air attack. They sacrificed armor and heavy guns for speed and massive anti-aircraft capability. The Juneau could put up a wall of flak that could shred incoming aircraft. She was fast, capable of over 32 knots, and she was needed desperately. In early 1942, the U.S. Navy was losing the Battle of the Pacific. Aircraft carriers were the key to naval warfare, and protecting them from Japanese air attacks was critical. Ships like the Juneau were designed to screen carriers, to shoot down Japanese bombers before they could launch torpedoes or drop bombs. The 5 Sullivan brothers reported aboard the Juneau in February 1942. George, the eldest at 28, had previous Navy experience. Francis was 27. Joseph was 24. Madison was 23. Albert, the youngest, was just 20 years old. They were assigned to different divisions aboard the ship, spreading them across various departments. But they were together. That's all that mattered to them. For 9 months, the Juneau operated in the Pacific. She escorted convoys, she screened aircraft carriers during operations. She fought in several engagements. The Sullivan brothers became well known aboard the ship. Having 5 siblings serving on the same vessel was unusual, and the crew looked out for them. The brothers wrote letters home regularly, reassuring their parents that they were safe and together. Their mother, Albert Sullivan worried constantly. She'd agreed to let all 5 sons enlist together, but the fear of losing them never left her. Their father, Thomas Sullivan, tried to be supportive, but he understood the risks better than most. Still, the family took comfort in the fact that the boys were together. They could look out for each other. In November 1942, the Juneau was assigned to Task Force 67, supporting the Guadalcanal campaign. The battle for Guadalcanal had been raging since August. American Marines had landed on the island and captured the Japanese airfield, but holding it required constant naval support. Supply convoys needed protection. Japanese naval forces were constantly trying to bombard the airfield and land reinforcements. The waters around Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound because so many ships from both sides had been sunk there. On the night of November 12, 1942, Task Force 67 engaged a Japanese naval force in what became known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. It was a chaotic night battle at close range. American and Japanese ships maneuvered in the darkness, firing at muzzle flashes and radar contacts. The Juneau was hit by a Japanese torpedo during the engagement. The torpedo struck forward, damaging the ship but not sinking her. The Juneau's crew fought to control the flooding and keep the ship operational. By dawn on November 13th, the battle was over. The Japanese had withdrawn, but Task Force 67 had taken heavy damage. Several ships were sunk, or severely damaged. The Juneau, though hurt, was still afloat. The decision was made to withdraw south, away from Guadalcanal, to regroup and make repairs. The surviving ships formed up and began steaming away from the combat zone at reduced speed. The Juneau was struggling. Her forward section was flooded from the torpedo damage. Her speed was limited, but she was making it. The crew believed they'd survived the worst. They were heading to safety. The 5 Sullivan brothers had made it through the night battle. George had been at his gun mount, firing at Japanese ships. Francis had been helping with damage control. Joseph, Madison, and Albert had been at their stations. They were alive. They were together. They were going home. At 11:01 a.m. on November 13, 1942, everything changed. The Japanese submarine I-26, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Minoru Yokota, had been stalking the damaged American ships. Yokota had tracked the task force as it withdrew. He positioned I-26 for a shot at the formation. From a range of about 3,000 yards, he fired a spread of torpedoes. One torpedo struck the USS Juneau on the port side, in almost exactly the same location where she'd been hit the night before. But this time, the result was catastrophic. The torpedo detonated the Juneau's forward magazine. The magazine contained ammunition for the ship's 5-inch guns. Hundreds of shells, each containing dozens of pounds of explosives. When the torpedo's warhead ignited the magazine, the resulting explosion was apocalyptic. The entire forward section of the ship disintegrated. The explosion was so powerful that ships miles away felt the shock wave. A massive fireball erupted from the Juneau. Debris, pieces of the ship, equipment, and bodies, was thrown hundreds of feet into the air. The cruiser broke in half. The bow section simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the magazine detonation. The stern section, structurally compromised and flooding rapidly, rolled over and sank in less than 20 minutes. Of the 687 men aboard the USS Juneau, most were killed instantly by the magazine explosion. Those in the forward sections of the ship were vaporized. Those in the middle sections were killed by the blast wave and flying debris. Those in the stern sections were thrown into the water as the ship broke apart and sank. About 140 men survived the initial sinking. They were in the water, many wounded, clinging to debris, wearing life jackets if they'd had time to grab them. The other ships in the task force saw the explosion. They saw the Juneau disappear in seconds, but they didn't stop to search for survivors. This decision haunts naval historians to this day. The task force commander made a calculated choice. There was a Japanese submarine in the area. It had just sunk the Juneau. Stopping to search for survivors would make the other ships sitting targets. The submarine could pick them off one by one. Additionally, the task force had reported the sinking and the approximate position. Rescue operations were supposed to be dispatched from shore bases. But communication failures, confusion about the exact location, and the assumption that few could have survived such a catastrophic explosion all contributed to a fatal delay. No rescue mission was sent for 8 days. For 8 days, approximately 140 survivors floated in the Pacific Ocean north of Guadalcanal. They had no food, no fresh water. Many were wounded. The tropical sun burned them during the day. The nights were cold. Sharks began circling. One by one, the survivors died. Some died from their wounds. Some died from dehydration and exposure. Some were taken by sharks. Others simply gave up, overcome by despair, and slipped beneath the waves. Were the 5 Sullivan brothers among the initial survivors? We don't know for certain. Some accounts suggest that one or more of them made it into the water alive. But if they did, they didn't survive long. The official records state that all 5 Sullivan brothers were lost when the Juneau sank. Whether they died instantly in the magazine explosion, or died in the water over the following hours or days, the result was the same. All 5 were gone. On November 21, 1942, 8 days after the sinking, a PBY Catalina flying boat on patrol spotted survivors in the water. Only 10 men were still alive. 10 survivors out of 687, the rest had died waiting for rescue that came too late. The telegrams arrived at the Sullivan home in Waterloo, Iowa, in January 1943. 5 telegrams. 5 sons. All missing and presumed dead. Albert Sullivan collapsed when she received the news. Thomas Sullivan, a railroad worker, left work and never went back. The loss of all 5 sons in a single day was unprecedented. No American family had ever suffered such a loss in military service. The story made national headlines. The tragedy of the Sullivan family became a symbol of the cost of war, of the sacrifices American families were making. The Navy immediately changed its policy. The sole survivor policy was created, stating that if a family lost multiple sons in service, the remaining sons would be exempt from combat duty. More importantly, brothers would no longer be allowed to serve on the same ship or in the same unit during wartime. The policy exists to this day. It's been modified and refined over the decades, but the core principle remains: no family should have to endure what the Sullivans endured. The Navy named a destroyer after the 5 brothers. The USS, the Sullivans, DD 537, was commissioned in 1943 and served throughout the remainder of World War II. The ship still exists today as a museum ship in Buffalo, New York. The Sullivan family was honored repeatedly, but for Thomas and Albert Sullivan, no honor could replace their sons. Albert spent the rest of her life advocating for military families. She spoke at war bond rallies. She met with other families who'd lost sons. She turned her grief into a mission to support others facing similar loss. Thomas struggled more. He became increasingly bitter and withdrawn. He died in 1965. Albert outlived him by more than a decade, finally passing away in 1972. Neither parent ever fully recovered from losing all 5 sons on the same day. For 76 years, the USS Juneau rested on the Pacific seafloor, her exact location unknown. The Navy knew approximately where she'd sunk, but the deep ocean had claimed her completely. Search technology in the 1940s through the 1990s wasn't capable of finding a wreck in deep water without knowing its precise location. In March 2018, Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel, the same ship that had found the USS Indianapolis and the USS Lexington, began searching for the Juneau. Using advanced sonar and ROV technology, the team located a wreck on the seafloor at approximately 4,200 meters depth, over 13,000 feet down. The ROV descended with cameras. What it found was unmistakable. The USS Juneau, broken into 2 main sections, sitting upright on the seafloor. The bow section was heavily damaged, consistent with a catastrophic magazine explosion. The stern section was more intact, though clearly the ship had been torn apart by the blast. The identification was confirmed through analysis of the wreck's unique features. The Juneau's distinctive armament, the 8 twin 5-inch gun mounts, was visible. The ship's dimensions matched. The location corresponded to where the sinking had been reported. This was USS Juneau, CL-52. The Navy officially confirmed the identification. Memorial services were held for the families of the 687 men who died. Special attention was paid to the Sullivan family. Though Thomas and Albert were long dead, their surviving relatives finally had a location, a place where their family members rested. The wreck of the Juneau sits as a war grave, protected by law. No salvage is permitted. The ship and the 687 men aboard her will remain exactly where they fell, 2 miles down in the South Pacific. The discovery brought closure but also renewed attention to the decisions made after the sinking. Why didn't the other ships stop to search for survivors? Could more men have been saved if a rescue had been attempted immediately? Naval historians have debated this for decades. The task force commander's decision to keep moving, to not stop and search, was tactically sound given the presence of a hostile submarine. But the failure to dispatch a rescue mission from shore for 8 days was inexcusable. The breakdown in communication, the confusion about the location, and the assumption that no one could have survived the magazine explosion all contributed to 130 deaths that might have been prevented. The 10 men who survived 8 days in the water proved that rescue was possible. If help had arrived within 24 or 48 hours, dozens or even over 100 men might have been saved. Among them might have been one or more of the Sullivan brothers. The story of the USS Juneau and the 5 Sullivan brothers changed American military policy permanently. The sole survivor policy exists because of them. The principle that siblings shouldn't serve together in combat zones exists because of them. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain if it prevented other families from suffering the same loss. But the question remains, should the Navy have allowed the 5 Sullivan brothers to serve together in the first place? The policy against it existed for good reason. The risk was known, and the Sullivan family paid the ultimate price for the exception that was made. Today, the USS Juneau rests at 13,000 feet, a tomb for 687 American sailors, including 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. The wreck serves as a reminder of the cost of war, of the sacrifices families make, and of the importance of policies designed to prevent such concentrated loss. The 5 Sullivan brothers wanted to serve together. They got their wish, and they died together, victims of a single torpedo that triggered a magazine explosion and sent their ship to the bottom in 20 minutes. Their story lives on in the sole survivor policy, in the destroyer named after them, and in the wreck sitting 2 miles down in the South Pacific, where 687 men continue their eternal watch.